Welcome to the North East Shadow MPC, a partnership between Clive, Owen LLP and the Northern Echo. There's been a mixed bag of figures recently. Inflation is rising, unemployment is falling, and GDP was less positive than expected. We want to know if our members are seriously considering an interest rate rise to tackle the inflationary pressures, or is that not a great concern at the moment? Are other factors in play? Furlough comes to an end shortly, and we've seen the full effects of the pingemic on the shortage of workers in sectors such as hospitality. And finally, in this discussion, we'll have a show of hands as the Shadow MPC members vote on what they would do if they were members of the real Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. Will they increase or decrease rates or keep them the same? Interest rates are currently 0.1%. Let's start with the organisation that's helping us put this together, Clive Owen LLP. We've got Nicola Bellerby on. Hello, Nicola. What are you seeing from your clients and the general economy that you're encountering day to day?
The interesting point is that furlough is still continuing, and some of the clients are still using that. And the ones that we're looking back at accounts are saying that furloughs really saved the day. They wouldn't have been able to continue without those furlough payments. Some accounts are showing sort of that they're not making any money, but haven't lost any because that furlough stepped in. So that's been brilliant, and the clients are complimenting the government on how they've done that. But what we're seeing now is clients struggling to get staff back at times, partly the pandemic and partly because sometimes their staff want to stay on the furlough. But something new that's been happening lately is that clients are saying they're struggling to get materials and parts for what they sell. So this is an issue. They think it's down to coronavirus rather than Brexit. But of course, if you're selling one item and you can't get one part, you can't sell it. And This is I'll be really interested to hear what everyone else has to say on that, because that's something that I've never really come across that much in the past, but it really seems to be that they're struggling now. And of course, if they can't sell anything, then we're going to have a different sort of problem on our hands.
Okay, well, Nicola, that's a very helpful starting point. Let's go to some of the other members and we just have a look at them. I've got Ajay Jaqota joined us. We've got David Coates from NewsQuest, Catriona Lingwood from Constructing Excellence, James Robson from Entrepreneurs Forum, Christopher White from Darlington Building Society, Paul Gibson from Active Financial Planners, Chartered Financial Planners, and Chris MacDonald from Materials Processing Institute. We just heard about materials and core components, Chris, so let's talk to you next. What do you see the current state of play in the global economy and how it relates to the North East?
Thank you, Graham. And you're right, I do want to pick up on the point Nicola made. So I think inflation is a big concern for people at the moment. The last OBR forecast, I think, was in March, and it was forecasting 1.6, 1.8% for the year. But I don't really think any of us believe that is going to be the outcome for the year. Certainly the last couple of months look more than that. And materials is a real concern. So if anybody is trying to carry out a little home improvement project all the way up to big businesses doing infrastructure projects, we're all finding that it's not just a question of material inflation, but actually getting materials at any price is a problem. Sitting where I sit, I can see that this is related to global supply chains. It's perhaps a bigger issue for the UK than just emerging from COVID. It's about how we have resilient domestic national supply chains in the future and how we deal with that. So it's a bigger area of policy. But certainly this area of inflation and material shortages is one that's going to be with us for a while.
Now, Chris, I know you deal with a lot of industrial specialisms in your business, but you also have a good look at the general economy. You mentioned inflation right at the beginning. Honestly, I can't help but feel a little bit sorry for people who are older on fixed incomes. If they have savings in the bank, say £50,000 life savings or even £100,000 life savings, if inflation is 2.5% and interest rates are 0.1%, that is a massive tax of maybe a couple of £1,000s a year on people's life savings. Do you think people should take that into account when setting rates now?
So you're right about the impact of older people and pensions, but there's also house price inflation is really racing away as well. So we've got young people trying to get onto the property ladder at the start, and really struggling to save enough for a deposit as well. So I think what you're saying is, Graham, there's a real world impact of this and that's affecting people's lives, it absolutely is, and that's all part of the balancing act with the Monetary Policy Committee.
All right, well, let's pick up on housing and talk to a couple of people who are in the housing sector. We've got 3 people who are in housing, AJ, Catriona, but let's go to Chris White at Darlington Building Society. Where do you see things settling in the economy at the moment?
Hey, it's certainly an interesting time. Thanks, Graham. So we've touched there upon kind of HPI and the fact that we're obviously seeing quite significant house price inflation. And I think Chris quite rightly picked up there on the impact that has, particularly on first-time buyers, and makes it all the more challenging for them to access the market. I think kind of outside of that cohort, we've seen certainly in the first half of this year, the demand for housing has just been enormous off the back of the pandemic. We've seen impacts like people wanting to kind of move house to kind of more rural areas, and some impact of people wanting to move away from kind of London and other large cities. And certainly there's been a kind of significant demand, and we've seen some of our highest kind of pipeline kind of figures within our mortgage business that we've seen in a very, very long time. I think, the interesting thing kind of for me in the economy at the moment is that you do kind of combine the kind of HPI and inflation, and kind of, I guess, the impact on kind of people's pockets with that inflation is definitely going to have an impact on people. I guess we are seeing wage inflation kind of alongside that, I guess, go up as well. But I think that the pressure kind of on the MPC for interest rates in the second half of this year is going to be really, really significant. I know there's an awful lot of talk about the impact on inflation being a temporary one, but there's also, I guess, narrative of the rate kind of going over 3% and even towards 4%. And I think it'd be very difficult to continue to argue interest rates where they currently are if we get to those heady heights of inflation.
If that's the case, Chris, I'll just ask you, wouldn't it be better to strike now? Would it be better in this shadow MPC to put your hand up for a minor increase in interest rates? For example, put it back to 0.75%. That's what it was before COVID. And it hasn't been more than 1% for 10 years.
So I think there's no getting away from the fact that currently the argument for interest rates increasing is the strongest argument it's been for a very long time. For me, we'll come to the voting, I guess, in a minute, as it were, but I guess we've seen some positive signs in the inflation. I think some of the talk around the kind of economy overheating is a little early. So for me, I think that we probably needed to keep our powder a little dry for the meantime in that area. I think what was interesting in the actual MPC kind of at the last meeting was some of the talk around what the actions around QE should be, and I think that there's definite kind of room, shall we say, in QE easing for the MPC to take some steps there that might be not quite as drastic as a interest rate rise, but nonetheless kind of have the required impact on the economy.
Stop printing money, in other words. All right,
Yep.
let's move to... Maybe we'll have a vote on QE as well at the end. We'll see what people think on QE too. Let's go to AJ and then Catriona, then we'll get out of the property market and look at some other areas. AJ, you're in property as well. What's your view on interest rates and its effect on your market at the moment? Oh, hang on, you muted, AJ. Sorry about that.
I'm muted now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So I echo a lot of the points that Chris made just now. I think it's too early to start talking about interest rate rises. I think as central banks across the globe, you'd be hard pushed to see any economy start raising interest rates so early. I do believe this is transitory. I do think we've come out of this, really, really fast, really hard. That's increased pressure on demand on all sorts of sectors, including housing. And I think that will settle down in the second half of the year. So for me, I would say let the economy boom. We're not going to hit a bust, that's for sure, but let it boom a little bit. Let's get ourselves back to some normality, and then maybe we can start talking. I think the first step is definitely going to be QE and pull back from printing this money. That's got to be the first step.
Okay, let's move to Catriona then, because I know you're dealing with a lot of construction firms. You heard about shortages that Nicola mentioned. Are your members seeing that at Constructing Excellence?
Yeah, I think it's more the SME market are struggling with the shortages more than the major sort of like developers and larger contractors. because they can actually afford to forward buy and what have you, whereas a lot of the SME market do a sort of day-to-day basis where if they need something, they'll go to their builders merchants. So they are finding huge shortages, and the shortages are causing an absolute enormous increase on costs with regard to materials as well. I mean, you've got many of the builders merchants already this year have put up their prices by 15%, which is quite considerable. If you're on a fixed term contract, it's having a major impact with regard to the original price that you quoted to what you actually it's costing you in materials now. So it's having a knock-on effect, and I think that is having an effect on everybody. There's also a huge skills shortage as well. I think that we experienced this before we went into the pandemic anyway, in certain areas of the skill sets. But this has been impacted obviously by Brexit and the EU workforce and what have you, had a knock-on effect from obviously London and the southeast to the rest of the country, and people can get better wages now, so that they're going to other parts of the country for higher wages, and it's got a knock-on effect in the northeast. So it's a bit of a problem really, and it's how do we manage this at the moment, and looking forward to sort of 2022.
Okay, thank you very much, Catriona. Let's move on to our next person. Let's talk to someone who can give us a more general view of the economy, and that's David Coates of NewsQuest. Of course, the Northern Echo in the northeast, but other papers around the country. Advertising revenue is susceptible to the economy in general terms, isn't it, David? What's happening in your experience?
Well, things are getting better, and quite a lot better, actually. I am a bit worried about inflation, I have to admit. But if you look at the advertising market in general, when the pandemic first hit, there was, programmatic advertising rates went through the floor, digital advertising, lots of customers immediately put their budgets. But it's come back really very strongly, and we've seen a real improvement in the yield we're achieving from advertising sales, both from a print perspective but primarily from a digital perspective. But
you're also investing. I keep seeing new journalists being taken on, new people to work on on the marketing of your products. In bringing these new people on, are you seeing wage inflation, or is it just the cost of more staff?
It's really the cost of staff. It's finding the staff that's the difficulty. We really are struggling to find people to fill certain roles. So there's a lot more competition out there for people. So we went through a difficult period where we had to lose people. We're now actually seeing things recover, and we're struggling to get people back because there's a bit of competition around for talent. So that is an issue. Getting the right people for the right roles is challenging at the moment.
We're going to do a vote on interest rates soon, and on QE. What do you think you'll settle on? Well, you don't have to stick to it on your vote if you hear something different in a moment. But what's your instinct before you vote?
Well, I've been attending these meetings right since the start. I think from the first one, and I've never yet voted for an increase. Today, I'm going to change that record. I'm going to vote for an increase today.
All right.
Because I'm concerned about inflation.
And you prefer to head it off with a small increase rather than be dealing with something that emerges as a real thing later?
Yes, I think it would be a small increase. I think it would be a start of a series of increases.
Okay.
Because I think the inflationary pressures are such that we need to do something.
David, thank you very much. Let's move on to our next guest. Let's talk to. We'll wrap up with Paul Gibson, but we'll talk to James Robson, who's Entrepreneurs Forum chairman. Obviously, a range of different companies who are members of the forum, but they all have one thing in common: they own their own businesses. James, what's your take on it?
Morning, Graham. I think members, by definition, they're reasonably optimistic. And as an organisation, what they're really keen to do is obviously get back to some of our face-to-face events that we're starting in the autumn, now that we're allowed to, with the lifting of some of the regulations on mixing in larger groups. Many of them have had to do some significant pivots of their business during the pandemic. and they've spoken to other members to work out how to do that. A lot of them have come away, if they were in retail, on the high street, they've had to move away to e-commerce. Others have had to change quite a bit to protect their workforces, from pandemic rules. So it's been a very difficult 18 months for a lot of members. Quite a few members have taken a break from membership of the forum because they couldn't get to events, and the events are really a key part to what they enjoy about it. So we're now sort of driving to recruit members back again, and get them back into full participation. But on a more broad comment, one of the firms I'm involved with, on almost a day-to-day basis, is Dyer Engineering up at Concert, Anfield Plain. So that's a steel fabrication business, and they've had a really pretty torrid time this last 18 months because steel prices, raw steel, has gone up by about 100% in the last 6 months, and so having to go back to their clients, on a very regular basis to negotiate price increases, has been so time consuming for the management that, a lot of the other plans they had for expansion have had to be put on the back burner. But then flipping over to the support that SMEs have had, as you know, I sit on the investment committee up at NEL. We've invested over 7 million from the Seaballs loan scheme while it was available. And that's had a good uptake from the mid-size SME market, if you like, borrowing up to £500,000. That scheme's obviously now ended, and we're into the business recovery loan scheme, which isn't quite as attractive for the companies, but at least it is something else the government's put in place to continue to support small businesses to get fully through the pandemic.
And where do you think you'd sit on the cost of money, on interest rates?
I think I probably will also, like David, be suggesting a small rate rise, perhaps to 0.25% at this point, just to see, if I were the MPC, to see what effect it has, because in another 3 months' time, it might almost be too late, because if inflation's really started to take off and we're moving up to the high 3% into 4%, you might have to put in a much bigger rise at that point to cool it down. But I do agree with AJ that certain things may taper off. One of the drivers for inflation has been the cost of moving containers around the world, and that is a bit of a blip that hopefully will start to subside. The cost of getting a container from China back to Europe went up fourfold. So obviously anyone bringing produce out of Asia, was having to add that to the cost of their goods in the market. That should right itself, and those prices should come back to a more normal situation.
Okay. Thank you, James. I'm going to go to Paul Gibson from Active Chartered Financial Planners. A lot of advice being given to their clients who tend to be investing their money for their pensions and their long-term future. So, Paul, you've heard a lot of comments. What's your view on the general economic situation first?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything that's been said today. There's three things I quickly want to touch on. First of all, as you correctly said, we deal a lot with investments and pensions. Anyone who's been invested over the last 15 months since the pandemic hit have seen stellar returns for taking a little bit of risk. So the average balance portfolio is up 20% in the last 12 months. So a huge difference from investing in cash to taking that middle level of risk with investment and pension portfolios. So people are being massively rewarded. Moving on, clients are still taking the same levels of income as well, which has been interesting because they've not been able to enjoy it on some of this luxury expenditure. But what we found is people are not going on holiday, they're spending it on home improvements, and there seems to be a huge demand for camper vans and caravans at the minute as well. So they are still taking the same levels of income, making far more than the income that they need, which is really good from that side of things. To quickly touch on the mortgages, what we're seeing in the Northeast is we do mortgages. It makes up for about 10% of our business, so we're not huge players in the market. But with the reduction of the stamp duty holiday, we saw a huge flurry. We were up around 30% in 6 months. But there were lots of higher value mortgages, not necessarily first-time buyers. People reevaluating circumstances, as Chris said earlier, after COVID. And lots of clients starting to sell property as well because of the higher prices. We have seen a reduction since the stamp duty holiday is finished. And we've also very recently seen valuations being lowered. Now, this is the first time we've seen this. So people are looking to get mortgages, feeling that the house is worth X. Values are actually challenging that. So that's an indication that maybe the overinflation of prices might be coming towards an end. And finally, on the inflation piece, agree with a lot of what's been said today. Inflation or CPI at 2.5, RPI at 3.9. But you look at other areas, food prices, depending on which paper you read, could be up between 7 and 9%. Second-hand car prices up 10. And it's all bad news for cash holders as well, as a real spending power there money is being eroded. And the final thing that I've seen with business clients, I have clients that deal in steel and wood. And again, it's very what James said. They've seen their prices of raw materials more than double in the last 12 months.
So where will you sit then? You've heard everyone else, and you're
Yeah. I mean, I've seen we're in a very difficult position at the minute. I mean, we've got to pump sufficient money in the system to starve off deflation, which we've not even talked about today, but not push too much money in that inflation gets out of control. My personal view is that a gentle apply the brakes on QE would be the first step to take. That will probably throw an indicator to the markets that rates aren't going to stay at 0.1% forever. And yes, that will probably also curb asset prices as well. So that might be a bit of a starter for me.
If interest rates did rise, even if it was a modest 0.25%, would that have an effect on asset prices, on stocks and shares, on pension fund valuations, on people's managed funds, and some of those gains that you talked about, will they be lost?
I don't think they'll be lost, but I think what we've seen in recent months is that markets have settled down. And what you tend to find with markets is that they're always looking 3 to 6 months in advance. So yes, there's always shocks along the way when a pandemic comes or a financial crash, but markets tend to take into effect what may be happening in the future. And at the minute, there is a little bit of uncertainty. So markets have certainly leveled out. An increase in interest rates would certainly give them a bit of a dip, because it may be a longer term indication that interest rates are starting to rise, so people may be able to take a bit less risk and start to get a return on cash.
All right. Before we go into the vote, can we just have any other points? I saw AJ wanted to make a point. Do you want to turn your mute off? Yeah. AJ?
So one of the concerns that I have is variance, and I think it would be premature to think that we're out of this already. And my fear is if we make any financial moves now, we need to get the winter out of the way first. I think past the winter, I think we'll be in a much safer position to say that the pandemic is behind us, and whatever variants are going to come our way won't harm us the way that lockdowns did economically. So for me, that's another reason to play cautiously at the moment and allow inflation, which we've all agreed is mainly down to raw materials and other things that have built up over the pandemic, let those ease out. So my main concern also for not making any major moves, yes, we can ease off on the QE, but other than that, I would be extremely cautious, because that would just send a shock. If we did then sort of raise interest rates slightly, then we end up in some sort of quasi sort of lockdown across Europe, including the UK. We're back to square one. We're having to reverse everything.
AJ is a very good point. Any other final points before I call the vote? No. AJ, thank you for that. Oh, hang on. Well, David Coates is just going to come in with one more.
Just one quick point on the QE situation. The issue with winding back the QE position is what that does to bond yields, because the reason that we've got very, very low interest rates, I believe, is because of the QE that's been put in by central banks, which has deflated bond yields, put up asset prices, bond debt prices, and brought the yield on the debt down. If governments stop effectively buying their own debt in the bond markets, which is what will happen when we stop QE, that will reduce the price of bonds, which increases the yield on bonds, which means there's much more likely that we'll see a transfer of money from stock markets, equities into bonds, back into bonds. That could have big implications for interest rates.
Okay, fair point.
We could see a crash in the stock market.
Okay, AJ's got to go now, so I'm going to call the vote before he goes. Hang on, quick vote.
Okay.
For QE, would you stop QE? Yes, for putting your stopping QE. Hands in the air, please. Most say yes. Interest rates to go up. Hands in the air, please, by 0.25%. 2 for 0.25%. And for interest rates to be lowered, nobody. For interest rates to stay the same, a majority for that. Thank you very much, all our guests on today's Shadow MPC with the Northern Echo and Clive Owen LLP.